Great. Well, welcome. It is 12:33, so I think we'll begin our meeting now. There'll be a few people joining as we go, and people will drop out because that's how these things work very often. But welcome to this briefing on from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Migration. My name is Tim Farron. I'm the Member of Parliament for Westmoreland and Lonsdale in Cumbria. And what we have today is the opportunity for us to consider and look at what I'm going to say is an excellent report done by the APPG on migration and on our behalf by Fragomen. I'll introduce our panellists in a moment, and just to say, when it comes down to the discussion later on, I can see a number of people on the screen, but what I will be able to do for sure is see whether you raised your hand next to your name. So I'm assuming by now we know how to do this. So if you want to speak, please put your hand up in the Zoom way. If you can make sure you're muted, if you're not speaking, maybe an opportunity for you just to check that now. That'll be superb. So let's get going. So I think it's an obvious thing to say, but nevertheless worth saying that the UK economy is at a crossroads. We're dealing with a series of unprecedented shocks, combining, and presenting serious challenges. Migration has always played a significant role for both small and large businesses, enabling them to fill gaps or shortages in the UK labour market. To give you an example, my neck of the woods in the Lake District, in many ways you might consider it one of the least diverse parts of the United Kingdom. On the other hand, it is a place where, within the Lake District itself, 80% of the resident working age population is already working in hospitality and tourism. And by many people's assessment, up to 50%, just short of 50% of the workforce was from overseas up until 2020, up until the pandemic. So that gives you a picture of there being not much of a reservoir, shall we say, in order to fill the jobs that folks from overseas were filling, and I have to say, filling very, very well. But of course, on the 1st of January 2021, the UK's new points-based system came into effect. And last December, our all-party group heard from a range of employers about their hopes and fears for the new system. Working with Fragomen, we then conducted an inquiry to hear in real time the impact that employers from different sectors and in different parts of the country were starting to experience. So we extend a massive thank you to Fragomen, who of course are with us today, for their support and advice to us, and also to the almost 100 people who took the time, employers, taking the time to respond to our survey and share their reflections, their experiences with us. At this event, our aim is to share the findings from this inquiry, the excellent report that you should now have, and for us to share, and really for you to share your reflections as we consider it. We really want to discuss the reforms that the government could undertake to potentially ease the transition to new ways of working. The All-Party Group on Migration is just that. I obviously wear a party label, but hopefully I'm sufficiently venerable for people to understand that my role here and our role is to be genuinely cross-party. Our aim is not to score any points. Our aim is to look at the lived experience and see if we can, in a very helpful and collegiate way, share with the Home Office ways in which they can do things even better. So look, that's enough from me really. Let me introduce to you our three panellists who actually do know what they're talking about. And in order that they will be speaking to you, first of all, Gemma Hyslop, who is the author of the report and manager and solicitor in Fragomen's London office with more than 5 years of experience in immigration law. Following Gemma, I will introduce to you Louisa Gomez, campaigns advisor at the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. And last but not least, Madeline Sumption, who is a director of the Migration Observatory and a member of the Migration Advisory Committee. So I'll ask each of them to speak to us for roughly 5 minutes each. And then after that, I will be looking to you out there watching to raise your hands, to ask questions of one or all of them, or to raise a point from your own experience. We'll draw the conclusion, we'll draw stumps at about 25 past, 1, and obviously our hopes are that as a result of what we learned today, we'll have a clearer idea of what it is the government perhaps could be considering doing in order to improve the current situation for employers and for the economy as a whole, and for employees too. Final point from me: we often forget the massive benefits, I'm going to argue, to domestic UK employees of there being sufficient numbers of overseas ones. So if you're a cafe working in Ambleside, when you've got 10 staff, 5 of them for overseas and 5 of them the UK, and you can't get the 5 overseas ones, there's a reasonable chance that cafe collapses and the 5 British people lose their jobs as well. So we're not just here to talk about the interests of people who are migrants in this country, though we are concerned about that very, very much, or indeed just for the employers. We're also concerned about the impact on British employees of there not being enough people working in their sectors. That is enough polemic from me. I will shut up. Gemma, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here today. And it was a pleasure also to work on the report, which we hope, makes really interesting reading. It certainly chimes with a lot of other industry feedback, which has been very well publicised within the press, that whilst there are certain elements of the new immigration system that are working really well, there are a few small but significant changes that could be made to the existing immigration system to really benefit business and the UK economy as a whole. To very briefly summarise, the report really speaks to almost the development of 2 immigration systems. The first is for those businesses who are already previously engaged with UK immigration. For them, the new immigration system works really well. There have been liberalisations and positive developments, which means that it's easier for them to bring international talent into the UK. The second system is for those businesses, typically SMEs or micro industries, where they've not really had to engage with UK immigration before because they previously relied on free movement. No immigration system is ever going to be as easy as free movement, but for these businesses that are experiencing UK immigration for the first time, they're finding it really quite difficult and that it doesn't really suit their needs. Accordingly, our recommendations speak to those changes that could be made to improve access to the immigration system for those particular businesses and the sectors involved as well. The report includes a foreword from David Simmons as chair of the APPG, and then some broader context on the immigration rules themselves just to provide that setting. We also have a few case studies which illustrate the data that we've gathered, and then our key findings and recommendations which tie to those. In terms of the methodology, exactly as Tim said, the APPG met with businesses that were concerned about the new immigration system, and in response to that, we worked to develop a questionnaire which was sent to them and to the Fragomen clientele. And we got a really, really great response. Almost 100 businesses replied, all shapes and sizes, various geographical locations throughout the UK, so really very wide ranging. Those that responded actually was sort of a self-selecting responsive panel, but that in itself was really interesting because those businesses and sectors that are typically well served by immigration, sort of digital tech, financial services, etc., we didn't see responses from them in huge numbers because they're already well served by the system. But it was those sectors such as health and social care, hospitality, etc., that really were very vocal in their responses. And that's really indicative of the fact that those particular sectors are struggling with the new immigration system. In terms of our key findings and corresponding recommendations, they're obviously set out in the report, but at a high level, they include reducing the administrative burden that the sponsored work permit system currently represents, and also costs in certain areas because immigration can be prohibitively expensive for certain businesses. We also recommend a holistic consideration of what low-skilled means. The UK immigration system is very deliberately set up not to accommodate the movement of what is deemed to be low-skilled roles into the UK. But what we're finding is that that is making life very, very difficult for certain sectors. So a rethink of what that means and facilitating sponsorship, perhaps under existing routes or the development of sector-specific routes, is something that we really do recommend. Improving guidance and access to the Home Office assistance, stakeholder engagement, etc., is another key tenet of the report. And also cross-Whitehall strategy, exactly as Tim said, it's about working in a collegiate and collaborative manner to make sure that immigration is considered as part of broader government strategy, to make sure that when certain government projects are mooted, the demands that puts on labour can be met by way of immigration. Thank you, Tim.
Hugely helpful, Gemma. A great summary of the report and really helpful to point out the kind of key headline asks and conclusions, more of which later. Thanks, Gemma. So, Louisa, from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. So for the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, currently labor shortage is the main concern, which is reflective as well from the changes in the new immigration system. So we launched a survey from our members last week, and we surveyed almost 200 members, and labor shortage was pointed as a concern for 9 in 10 respondents of the survey, which comes at no surprise. And in terms of the data, when we asked about the causes of those shortages, skills shortage was pointed as the main cause, and the second one was the new immigration system that was pointed by 56% of respondents of the overall survey. But when we look at sector-specific data, when we look at the blue-collar sector, which involves hospitality, industrial construction, and logistics, that goes up to 65% of the respondents. They are struggling. Again, it's no surprise because those are sectors heavily reliant on overseas labor, temporary workers, and the so-called low-skilled. That's not necessarily the right term to refer to those workers. So for us, it's vital now that the government prioritize solving the immediate crisis. We see the response to that as perhaps some sort of flexibilization to the new immigration system to immediately respond to the issue, as well as improvements on the skills offer that we currently have, because currently the apprenticeship levy doesn't cater for the recruitment industry for temporary workers. We have seen some improvements in terms of offers of skills boot camps, but still it's a long way to go. So whilst we are able to retrain the internal workforce, we would ask for temporary relaxation of the current immigration rules. And just to add on that, the British Future published a report last week or 2 weeks ago about the Immigration's Attitudes Tracker, where 2/3 of the public agreed that employers should be able to recruit from overseas where there's there's labor shortage. So I think that we're kind of all moving towards the same direction to this situation. Yeah, I think that's pretty much my contribution for now. Thank you.
Louisa, thanks very much indeed. Very, very helpful, and we'll cover, I'm sure, those issues later on. Thank you for those introductory remarks. Madeline, who's the director of the Migration Observatory, and of course, very importantly and significantly, a member of the Migration Advisory Committee. Over to you.
Super, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to join you. What I thought I would do is just say a little bit about what we can say so far about the impacts of the new system. Kind of here we are 9 months in, and particularly in terms of data, what we know. It's obviously quite challenging because the new immigration system came in at a really weird time in our history. There was a national lockdown just a few days after pre-movement ended. So employers many employers were hiring less than usual anyway. Obviously we had some recovery towards the middle of the year, and then some specific issues also kind of pandemic related with everyone in hospitality sort of trying to hire at the same time. So I think in general, the kind of big caveat is this is a really odd time to be assessing the impacts of new immigration policy because there's so much other stuff going on, and hopefully we'll start to get a bit better picture as we sort of emerge from the pandemic. What we do know in terms of is firstly, not many EU citizens in the system. So if you look in the first half of the year, which is the period we have data for, if you exclude frontier workers who aren't primarily resident in the UK, then we had just over 7,000 EU citizens applying for work visas. So that's around 7% of the total. Now, those are pretty low numbers if you compare it to the pre-pandemic figures. 2019, for example, the estimate is that we had around, for work-related EU migration, alone, around 79,000 people coming long-term, so excluding short-term people, and that was around 45% of work-related immigration. So that's, and some of these low levels are going to be due to the pandemic, the fact that the system's relatively new. A lot of people could have come last year and still benefited from free movement. And so it'll take some time to see how much of that is really due to the post-Brexit immigration system. For non-EU citizens, interestingly, the skilled worker route applications are actually up on pre-pandemic levels already. So, I hear you saying, is this the impact of the liberalization that we had? So we got lower skill and salary thresholds, for example, the labour market test. I'm actually not totally sure of that. I think, it's still too early to say, but the published statistics that we do have, while they don't give us a full picture, they suggest that the increase is actually mostly driven by the health sector, and that it's a continuation of the previous trend where we've seen year on year of steady growth in the number of non-EU citizens being sponsored. And my expectation would be that the health, because most of the volume there is driven by nurses, and the NHS was already a big user of the system. We wouldn't expect the NHS to be the employer that is kind of most affected by the liberalisation. We have seen actually the numbers of people being sponsored in industries that have a fair number of middle skilled positions that could potentially be newly eligible, like construction and hospitality. They have gone up in percentage terms, but the numbers are still pretty low. We're looking like 300 to 400 people in the first half of the year. So certainly not something that would be driving the volumes. And so based on the data so far, it's not clear that we have kind of massive spike in employers taking advantage of the ability to hire people in middle skilled roles at the moment. But obviously we'll kind of need to dig through the data a little bit more as it comes out over time. In terms of the substantive impacts, obviously the big story of the last few months has been labour shortages and whether the new immigration system is causing them. I think it was always the expectation, if you cut off free movement very suddenly, that it would be quite disruptive for the businesses who had business models that were very reliant on EU workers. I think the empirical question that we can't yet answer, and that hopefully it will become possible to answer in the sort of coming months and year or so, is how easily the labour market will adjust. So is this a short-term blip before employers are able to adapt to slightly different immigration system and new labour market, or will there be sort of longer term impact? So that's something I think that we'll need to look at. I can't promise that there will be a super clear-cut answer to that, actually, because empirically these are actually quite difficult things to measure in the best of times, not least when you've got a pandemic messing up all of your data and so forth. So I'll leave it there, but yes, happy to answer any other questions that come up.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you also, Gemma and Louisa. So I'm going to say two things, first of all. One is, if you haven't seen in the chat, there is a link to the report, if you've not already seen it. So it's there for you to have a look at. The second thing to say is I'm going to ask you now if anybody's got any questions. I'm going to start off with a couple just to give you time to think of them. But if you don't mind putting your hand up on the icon next to your name, that will, and I will then see who's at the top of the list, and I'll draw people out to ask questions. So I guess if I was to start and throw something probably to just to get things started, to what extent does the panel think that training the existing UK workforce can be, or to what extent, can training the UK workforce reduce the need to import labour from abroad? How possible is that? What does the evidence tell us? What's your opinion, Gemma?
Thank you, Tim. It's a really interesting question. I think what's really interesting from the feedback that we received is a great many of the labour shortages that are being experienced are by businesses that have really put an emphasis on recruitment within the domestic labour market. So they've really tried to get British or resident workers to fill those roles. active recruitment, actually increasing salary scales where appropriate and where they can accommodate that within that business without having to pass that increase onto their clientele in too much of a stark manner. But the difficulty seems to be with a desire to engage with certain positions, sectors, which ties to some of the recommendations that we made within the report about consideration of how elements like the immigration skills levy is being used to benefit those sectors which appear to need a sort of almost a rebrand in terms of re-emphasising that these are sectors where people can find not just jobs but careers, and really start within that industry and grow and develop so they have a career for life as opposed to a job. So I think there's definitely a potential there, but it needs to be part of a broader strategy to make sure people understand that those are sectors really worth engaging with.
Thanks, Gemma. Louise, are any reflections on that?
Yes, if I could just say that when we have a conversation about training, we need to look at what's on offer at the moment. And those sectors, a lot of the offers for training are for skills of levels 3 and above. And we need to retrain people on skills 1 and 2, which are not catered by the new immigration system and are not catered by the skills on the training on offer at the moment. So I think the skills bootcamps are a step in the right direction, and they work for industries like construction, for example. But the fact that the apprenticeship system is not flexible enough to accommodate temporary workers, it's a concern for our industry. We place over 1 million people into work every day, into temporary work every day, and those are missing on the apprenticeship levy. So it might be the case that we're able to retrain the internal workforce, but we need a suite of training that it's fit for purpose.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Madeline, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. From a research perspective, there is some evidence that when the labour market is tighter, so if you've got very low unemployment, employers do, on average, tend to lower their expectations about who they're going to hire and are more willing to hire people, for example, from disadvantaged minorities or people who are less qualified for the jobs, which you might then expect would lead to more training. We don't see, there has been some attempt to try and measure statistically whether there's a relationship between whether there's less training when you have higher levels of immigration, and that didn't seem to be the case, based at least on the study that's been done so far for the UK. I think there are some examples where it seems like, kind of looking at it from the other perspective, lack of training in the UK might drive demand for migrant workers, and construction was always the classic example that was used, that where the UK had a much less organised training regime than, say, many Eastern European countries. But I think that there are limits to the ability to sort of train your way out of the demand for migrant workers. And that's partly just because the labour market doesn't need a fixed number of people with given skills. The labour market adjusts to who is in it, basically. And it may still be worthwhile for employers to bring over people from abroad, even if there isn't, a specific deficit of workers. So I think, there may be some kind of small relationships between training and demand for immigration, but I wouldn't expect, if we changed our training system, that it would dramatically shift the landscape.
Thanks, Madeline. I've got some other questions, but let's first go to Soren from TikTok, who's got a question or a reflection. You can unmute yourself. I think you're out there. Let me just double check. Soren, are you there?
Sorry, guys. I just had some technical problems with my.
It's all right.
I didn't put anything forward, but I suppose I had I did have a hand in I have made a point in the report. But yeah, so essentially we are so we use the intercompany transfer model a lot when we first came to the UK, and now we've really been able to expand hugely using the skilled worker. So I would say that in the tech industry, I would suggest that we have that the immigration system is working extremely well. But suppose we also pay very different salary levels to some of the businesses that have been represented on here, so in terms of construction and other industries where we're sort of more in the fintech, where simply there aren't any skills in the UK and in Europe for that matter. So essentially, when we're looking at our recruitment for our technical roles, we simply the applicants from the UK, from the EU as well, are simply not able to pass our tests, and we are simply finding that literally only the absolutely top of the pile in China, Russia, Ukraine, and the US are able to actually get in on this. So therefore, I think there is an element where we should train resident workers in fintech skills. However, I think it's a long road. It's a whole shift in the whole country ethos in terms of how we train people and what sort of roles we focus on. And even then, in terms of the populous mass of somewhere like Russia, China, there's just so many more people and so many more people focusing on this, that even when we have trained up all these people, they may still not be as good as some of the ones that are coming out of China, Russia, and India. So
yeah, Soren, thanks very much indeed. So just as a really helpful reflection, I've got Mary Alberg from Flex.
Hi, I'm from Focus on Labour Exploitation. I wanted to ask, Madeline, you mentioned that there are some sectors or industries, it's hard to say at the moment whether sectors or industries are going to adjust to the lack of labour from the EU. I was wondering if there are some sectors where you would expect it would be much harder to adjust, and which sectors those might be and why.
Sure, yeah. So I think, in principle, one of the challenges we have is that the data are not always good enough to really get a very detailed sense of what's going on in each industry. In principle, what we would expect if you have, given that we had free movement and then most EU citizens remained in the UK, and there was some departures last year, but not a mass exodus by any means, you would expect that the industries that would be hit first would be the ones that are relying on people who are newly arriving in the country. Now, anecdotally, I have my views about which ones those are likely to be, hospitality, seasonal workers, for example, probably less actually care, where you tend to get a lot of quite long-term workers in those jobs. But statistically, actually, it's just, we don't really have great data on turnover. And so the data sources we have don't actually show us who is, they're not very good at picking up newly arrived people. So I think, yeah, that would be one factor. Are they relying on people who have just arrived in the country? And then, of course, you have factors related to the industry, like obviously a lot of industries are relying on, have very low profit margins. And so their ability to put up wages is very limited. What I would expect in some ways, you can adjust, obviously, the adjustment that everyone talks about and that people like to imagine will happen is wages going up and that being good for everyone. In practice, I think that probably the adjustment that's more likely is just employers in certain industries producing less, either not expanding or shrinking slightly. And we saw with horticulture, for example, there was a big expansion in the production of soft fruit after 2004, basically because there were workers able to do it. We're anecdotally starting to see stories of the amount of land planted with labour-intensive horticultural products going down. So those kind of adjustments, I think, in the longer run is probably what would most likely drive. And people will have different opinions on whether that's a bad thing or not. It's actually not totally straightforward. That there is an optimal mix of what our economy should be producing.
Thanks very much, Madeline, and thanks, Mary. So, which is a really important point, I guess, that obviously, in theory at least, a a drying up of supply, if that is what's happening in certain sectors because of fewer migrant workers, might lead to certain sectors increasing pay and conditions. Madeline, is there much example, much evidence for that happening? It seems to me maybe not.
So far this year, based on the data we do have, which are not really good enough for the task, no. So we have very limited pay data, for example, by industry. If you look at an industry like hospitality, we're seeing pay levels basically sort of similar to 2019 levels. So we don't see, despite the discussion of labour shortages there isn't evidence of a kind of explosion in pay, so at least at the sort of median, which is what we have data for. But I don't want to say that it's definitely not happening just because the data are really not quite up to it for the moment.
And anecdotally, from my perspective, just in the Lake District, I have seen some employers significantly increasing pay terms and conditions, and it not doing the trick, them not filling those vacancies anyway. As I said, it's a bit of a stark figure. 80% of the entire population, working age population of the Lakes, already working in hospitality and tourism. So there just isn't a pool. Obviously, in some parts of the country, there will be a pool, potentially at least, but that's a really interesting reflection. I hope doesn't mind me putting him on the spot, but Luke from the Federation of Small Businesses made a comment in the chat, and I'd love to get your reflections on the report, but also the experience of you and your members over the last few months since the changes came in. Luke, if you're out there, we'd love to hear from you.
Tim, I'm not from the FSB.
Oh, right, sorry.
I work at the 3 million, but the reason why I so happen to know a little bit about...
I've reread it, yeah, go for it.
But the only reason why I know a little bit about the FSB Small Business Surveys and what they've been saying is because I've just come from another event where the head of policy was speaking exactly on this issue and had given some very, very interesting insights into what their membership had been saying. And particularly things like 48% from their survey that they did in 2019, particularly focusing on the points-based system, the sponsorship system. They said that they felt the cost was too high. There was this clear indication that based on recent surveys that they've conducted, that the second biggest issue is identifying skilled staff and skilled workforce. And that's appears to be very much reflected in the observations here. But what was particularly interesting was, and I think you guys have been touching on this, is this balancing exercise between generating skills within the domestic workforce, but at the same time trying to maintain immigration and making the UK an attractive place. And just on that, I actually had a question really, and this is something that had come up in the conversation that I had before, which was about the more soft power influencing of attracting people to come to the UK. And given the fact that the conditions for migrants in this country haven't exactly got a good press at the moment, particularly on the back of Windrush and a lot of problems that people, particularly speaking to us at the 3 million, have been experiencing, and this sort of general spirit of hostility towards migrants institutionally within the country, but also there's a general sense of it. And I wonder to what extent the panel think that impacts on policy going forward, and if there are any changes done in terms of compliance to improving that point of view.
Luke, first of all, thanks very much for stepping up, and it's massively encouraging actually, because it proves that people will turn up to these events and listen, as you clearly did at the FSB thing. And a really, really important point about soft power, because I guess there's the issue about how easy or hard or accessible the system is, both from potential employees and also employers. There's also that step before that, which might be, the extent to which potential employees from overseas will want to engage. Do any of the panel have a view or any evidence as to what the UK's brand overseas might have, how it may have been changed in some ways that might impact upon people's willingness even to seek employment in the first place? Gemma.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting question. I think it's definitely a multifaceted issue in terms of the UK's overall perception. Fragomen's a global firm, so we have clients that we work with various different jurisdictions, and I know that exactly as Luke mentioned, some of the issues with windrush and hostile environments, now I think referred to as the compliant environment, it's a bit more friendly, have caused concerns. I mean, from an individual applicant perspective, and as and when we're dealing with people coming into the UK, there's generally a huge amount of enthusiasm for that, but typically it's because they're coming with employers that, those large organisations which have very established processes for global mobility, so there's a real emphasis on facilitating the move and making sure people are comfortable when they get here. I think from an employer perspective, the UK government, in terms of international benchmarking, we do pretty well in terms of the visa application process. It's pretty straightforward. Again, it's tailored to immigration systems. For those people who have used the immigration system a great many times, they're au fait with the process. They understand how it works. It's pretty slick. And in terms of the visa routes that are available, we obviously spoke about the fact that the sponsorship is not working for everyone, so that's an area that's ripe for reform. In terms of international competitiveness, the UK recently introduced the new graduate route, which is a replacement of the old Tier 1 post-study work. I know for international students, for example, if you're somebody who has the pick of countries to go to, be it Ireland, the US, or the UK, that was something that really was borne in mind. Once you finish your degree, can you remain and work in the UK? And of that graduate category is something that really brings the UK on par with other competing jurisdictions, specifically the US, for example. So that is a positive development. So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely concerns, and exactly as Luke said, from the 3 million in terms of the experience that some European nationals are having, we've received anecdotal feedback from our clientele. They've had some difficulties at the border, etc., which is something hopefully that the Home Office will be really keen to address.
Gemma, thanks very much. Louisa or Madeline, any reflections?
I would just briefly say, I think it's a really interesting question, kind of how immigration policies affect attractiveness. It's one of the things that we do know from research is that migrants often don't know that much about immigration policy. And are sometimes pretty surprised when they arrive and discover what they're going to have to do. So I think that people tend to, that qualitative research suggests that people often form their opinions based on these kind of broad factors and perceptions of what a country is like, whether that's the economic opportunities that they're looking for, or a kind of more generalized feeling of, is this a welcoming and safe society? And so things like windrush and the immigration system may play into that, but I think it'll just be one part of a much bigger picture.
Thanks, Madeline. Louisa, any comments from you? No, let's move on. Okay, thanks very much for that. I've got John Guthrie.
Hi, thanks very much, Tim. My name is John Guthrie from the trade body UK Hospitality. So very interested in joining this discussion. I'd like to largely agree with what Madeline said. I use these words to say that at the moment, it's quite difficult to get a really accurate read of what the labour market is going to be, what's going to be its settled state after the pandemic. We've got to see the end of the furlough scheme, the return of perhaps 1.6 million people, to the labour market. I know some of them are on part-time furlough, but I think we've got to really see that wash its way through to see what the new labour market post-COVID is truly going to be before we can take a view. I think the biggest appeal that we would make to government and, of course, to their advisors, MAC and so on, is not to have a sort of fixed view about what the migration policy should be. There was a very fixed recommendation from the MAC back in September 2018 that there should be no sort of unskilled or lower skilled migration at all. There shouldn't be a pathway at all. And this was going to be really difficult for a number of sectors, but so be it. This is, our view. And I think there just needs to be a little more latitude once we see the new conditions, and a preparedness to come up with sector-specific solutions. I think the Conservative Party had actually suggested that 3 days before the December 2019 election, that there could be sector-specific routes building on the example of agriculture. And I think, that is important. The reason why there shouldn't be such a sort of inflexible and rigid view is that things change. And, the MAC could hardly, be blamed for not predicting COVID when they reported in September 2018. We don't know. We really don't know how many EU nationals have left the UK. There's a spread of numbers. It might be the high hundreds of thousands, it might be the low hundreds of thousands. But, Keynes said that, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? Because the MAC did rely upon the stock of EU nationals being quite high and believing that that stock would not go down. Now, if it is going down because of COVID, then, the facts do change, and that might justify a reappraisal of policy. And finally, countries like Australia and Canada, we've modelled ourselves on Australia, a points-based system, and so on. When you speak to our hospitality association in Australia, they'll tell you that the government are forever changing the immigration rules and coming up with a new seasonal route or a new temporary route here and there. And I think that's something we perhaps ought to get used to and be prepared for, rather than an absolutely rigid framework. There never shall be, must there be, can there be any immigration pathway for people doing level 1 and 2 jobs.
John, massively helpful. Thanks very much. I'll not put those to the panel just now because of time, but I just think they're all great reflections and things that I would endorse, by the way, and in particular talking about sector-specific setups. Absolutely something which I know is in the report, that we have sector-specific programs, which has a wide recommendation. It's great to hear it from you. I see, because people are only known by their iPad or PC names, so I'm afraid the person who probably isn't called Swalpers, it's over to you.
Hi, no, I'm Sophia Wolpers from London. Hi, but I just wanted to add one little point basically about the point of measuring attractiveness and how the UK might have fared over the last couple of years in terms of effectiveness, especially when it comes to attracting EU talent. Because as Madeline said, attractiveness is not easily measurable, and migrants don't make their choices on the most kind of logical, rational choices. It is often an emotional choice, and it's very much based on obviously how much of a hope, or you can see that your life will be better in another country. With the pound having fallen quite a lot against the euro over the last 4 years, obviously some of those kind of rational choices have decreased, and at the same time obviously COVID and all the restrictions have made it more difficult to have that kind of mobile labour. I think many on the EU side who would give the UK a try are going to be for at least probably year or another 2 years in kind of waiting position to see where it falls, because it doesn't really come down to how difficult is the immigration system. But obviously for EU citizens going from nothing to a lot, they do know that there is that hurdle, which will impact, and that will probably especially hold people back who are in that kind of middle skill level, who are not quite sure what is possible and what's not. And there is obviously the whole about not just Windrush, all of the negative press, and in the kind of very xenophobic way that immigration has been looked at over years, that really shapes the kind of emotional decisions of migrants of where they want to go. And other countries have been slightly better about that. And obviously people have a choice of where they want to go. And I think that that's one thing where the UK really needs to work on and make sure that the Home Office does portray itself as an attractive department to engage with for migrants, not just negative. And it really needs to start trying to produce positive stories. Otherwise, I mean, there's always going to be sectors, especially in London, who are going to attract talent from across the world, because if you look at finance or tech, that is where the best of the best sit. And if you want to be there, then you will make it. But I don't think it's the people we're ever going to have trouble attracting. It is all the other sectors that I think are already currently struggling with the labor shortages. So that's, I think, where it should be concerted effort between government and businesses to try and attract the people.
Sophia, thanks very much indeed. That's a massively helpful set of observations there. I will come to the panelists for some sort of final reflections in a minute or three. But I've got Akeachi from Migrants at Work out there.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Tim. There is one question really bothers me, or in my head, is according to the research carried out by Coventry University. So you have, for example, 82% of employers are finding it hard to fill some vacancies, and 65% of the businesses said that they were unable to fill this role, or they could not find candidates with the right skill and experience. And we know that, for example, refugees and asylum seekers have been in this country, some of them for a long time. Many of them have skills the UK government or the UK businesses need. But what the research shows is that employers are afraid of recruiting these skilled workers who are already here, or they don't understand immigration law, because immigration law is way too complex for them. So the work we've been doing at Migrant Work is to educate employers to understand immigration law, and migrant as well to understand immigration law. So my question is, instead of the government going overseas to try to bring new migrants to work in the UK or create new visa scheme to bring new migrants to the UK, why the government simply does not comply with its legal obligation under international law to educate migrant and employer in immigration law so that it's become easy for employer to recruit the talent already here?
Okay, great question. And obviously there are thousands of people seeking asylum in the United Kingdom at any given time, and they, broadly speaking, don't have the right to work. So just a quick set of observations from the panel on that one. Gemma?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I absolutely agree. It's a really, really valid point, and something that is definitely worthy of government reflection. In terms of employers being worried about engaging with immigration, that's definitely something that we've seen from our research. In fact, one of the main concerns cited from employers, either not engaging with the sponsor license system or just being concerned about immigration as a whole, was the legal complexity behind it, specifically around right to work. And that stems from the government's focus on the hostile, now compliant environment, where there really was a sort of but almost sort of outsourcing immigration compliance from the Home Office to employers, whereby if employers get it wrong and they're actually employing someone who does not have the appropriate right to work, they can face fines of up to £20,000 per illegal worker. So that obviously can be really quite concerning for some people when they're working in a legal context, which they don't find clear. So one of the recommendations put in place is definitely to increase sort of resources, etc., so people can understand right to work, and hopefully that will improve their confidence in recruiting from the migrant labour population already in the UK. In terms of right to work linked to asylum, I wholeheartedly agree that's a sort of an untapped resource in the UK, so hopefully something that the Home Office will reflect upon. I just very briefly point to a pilot the Home Office has agreed in terms of displaced talent. So the pilot is not yet in place, but the government have agreed to basically a pilot that will look to bring people who are displaced overseas, specifically in Lebanon and Jordan, to the UK to work under the existing work permit route, basically removing administrative burdens that particularly impact that particular demographic. So that will form part of a complementary pathway, and it's really important that that functions alongside a compassionate and effective asylum system. But some good news there. Thank you. Thanks,
Gemma. Louisa.
And just to add a little bit on that, I think that we could do with some more awareness around the rights of the settlement scheme as well. I think a lot of people that were on pre-settled status might have left the country and during the pandemic and might think that they're overstayed and outside the UK, and that might have broken their continuous residency. And guidance was only published in June about that. So if we increase a little bit the awareness, we might be able to bring some people back or make some people more comfortable here. And also we work for employers to make sure that they are doing the right thing in terms of right to work checks.
Thank you, Louisa. Madeline?
I've got nothing to add, thanks.
Okay, well, thanks for that, all three of you. And I just want to bring in, I've got one last question with a hand raised. Jean Lambert.
Okay. Thank you. My experience is more as having been a member of the European Parliament and working at the European level on migration policy. But I wanted to ask a question, not just about the initial recruitment, but about retention of staff, and whether there are changes, within the current rules that would actually help staff to stay, to change jobs, whatever, that once all that effort has gone into recruitment, that we don't actually then lose people. And maybe also a comment about the role of, I suppose, the Department of Work and Pensions and the like in this. We hear a lot about the Home Office, but where, what's the influence of those who are looking at the wider sort of employment policy and labour market needs?
Thank you. Yeah, who'd like to jump in there?
Just really quickly, I think one of the recommendations of the report, which we endorse as well, is a cross-government and industry forum. And in our view, it's not just about different government departments coming together, but as well hearing the industry and making sure that everything has been taken into consideration. So I think that would help. And also, I think some sectors, they are heavily reliant on temporary workers because they work in peak. So in construction, for example, you have people working for 6 months in a project and then leaving. But we are working with our members in terms of attraction and retention as well, and improving working conditions, not just by raising salaries, but by improving working conditions as a whole. And there's a joint initiative to be a joint conversation to take place in that front. For example, in roadside facilities for drivers, which need improvement. It's not just up for the industry to sort. So we're kind of covering that basis where possible as well.
Thank you very much. Just a final question from Grace. I see.
Oh, hello. Just a question on, it's just strange when somebody's looking for work and you keep hearing that there's skills shortage, there's staff shortage. Just wondering whether there's enough communication with the job centers and the public that's in unemployment. Not sure how this balances out and how this works out, that there's shortage of staff and then there's a high unemployment. The next question is, when employer are asking for right to work for people with indefinite leave to remain, what is the cause for that?
What is the call for it, Grace?
Yeah. People with indefinite leave to remain being asked for evidence for right to work.
Okay, Grace, thanks very much. There's 2 points there. Really, I guess there's the simple question about there are staff shortages in certain areas and yet high unemployment. So I guess there's a contrast there. So the extent to which job centres are doing their job in matching people to posts. And then also just a question about the experience of people with indefinite leave to remain being asked for evidence for their right to work. Any one of the panel like to comment on that, Gemma?
Yes, thank you, Tim. Absolutely. Two great questions. I just briefly on the first point about shortages, I wholeheartedly agree there needs to be communication there. I mean, one thing the government have said is that they're going to try to be a little bit more dynamic about their shortage occupation list, which basically attracts a slightly lower government application fee to allow employers to bring in people into roles which are documented as shortage in the UK, so they simply cannot find the staff within the resident labour market. So there's definitely a focus on that, being more agile in response to those shortages, which sort of goes to John Guthrie's point about just being a little bit more responsive. In terms of the indefinite leave to remain point, I mean, anybody who applies for a job and starts work in the UK needs to prove their right to work, even if they're British, by the presentation of their passport. People with indefinite leave to remain, I think this may be the point the Grace is getting at. If you've got indefinite leave to remain endorsed in an old passport, you need to make an application for a new biometric residence permit. Unfortunately, a right to work check against an endorsement in an expired passport will not establish that statutory defence to an allegation of illegal working. And I know that people have sometimes been a little flummoxed by that because it means another visa application when they've already got indefinite leave to remain. But you know, it's an example of a sort of an administrative step that the Home Office have mandated. So it is important that employers engage with that.
Thanks, Gemma. I'm going to draw things to a close now. We're just about at past. I want to say massive thank you to everybody who's been on the call. Just to, if I can draw things together, I've been really interested to hear everybody's feedback and the comments and questions of a number of you out there. Very grateful to Gemma, Louisa and Madeline. Obviously, from looking at Louisa and Madeline's contributions about the scale of the issues out there, and Madeline making a perfectly reasonable observation, which is it's very early to tell. Here we are going through COVID, lots of the data just isn't present yet, and we can't make every decision based upon anecdotes. What information we do have, though, indicates that there are challenges, that we've got significantly fewer people entering the workforce from overseas, and Louisa obviously talking about the responses of employers who have, you know, in particular in the blue collar areas, are what 65% of them are struggling, and you know what is it they're struggling with, and what are the issues? And obviously Gemma in drawing the top lines from the report, which I've seen is out there again, so please do download it yourself, and please do look at it, and please take the recommendations and consider them, and particularly if you are in a position to influence the outcome of Home Office decision making. But just, you know, the reflections that the report focuses on, clearly for a vast number of employers, particularly smaller ones and in certain sectors, dealing with immigration, the system at all, is new to them. And so that is always going to be a challenge. Nevertheless, I think the administrative burden and the costs are something which is at a time when, you know, running a business is more expensive than it's been for a while, should we say, is a cost which is an unwelcome one, and is potentially a hampers them in their growth, and indeed in the number of people they can employ. How wise it is, and I'm certain it is, to reconsider what low skill means. You know, many people would consider it's not. It's a slightly much more than the size. It's a pejorative way of describing anybody. But in any event, there are a whole bunch of professions where there are clear shortages, and where we perhaps need to reconsider what low skill means. And more than one person has talked about, Gemma introduced it, but plenty of people since, including John Guthrie, talked about the need for sector-specific programmes. And I absolutely reflect that in hospitality and tourism in our own neck of the woods, in particular when it comes to the position regarding chefs, but lots of other areas as well. And then more generally, more guidance for people. This is a scary world in the sense that it's all new to so many people, and when they're just taking advantage of freedom of movement and haven't had to go through this process of sponsorship. So it's not just expensive, it just feels scary. It feels like something that they are new to. This is an excellent report, I'm bound to say that. So I want to massively thank Gemma, Louisa and Madeline for their contributions today, but also to Fragomen more generally for what is an excellent report. So many of you have the ability to develop things going forward. Obviously, if you're an employer and you've got more to tell us, please get in touch. Please tell us your experiences, because this is not frozen aspect. We want to continue to feed back to government so that we're making decisions based upon evidence. And if you are, parliamentarians, it's great to see a number of us on this call. Very grateful to you, officials in the Home Office. I hope you'll take what's been said today and what is in the report in the spirit it's intended. We're looking at how the new system is working, and we're looking at ways in which we can make it work better. With that, thanks all of you for spending the hour that you have with us. In particular, thanks to Gemma, Louisa and Madeline, our panellists. And with that, I'll bid you good afternoon.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.